What's up, guys? My name is Robbie Hart. I'm one of the expert IELTS trainers here at IELTS Coach Pro. This is Method Mondays, where we teach you all the tips, tools, methods, and strategies that you need to get an excellent score on your IELTS exam. Today, we are looking at the top 8 tips for IELTS speaking. And this is going to be really helpful. But before we get into the tips, please click that subscribe button if you're preparing for IELTS. You don't want to miss a video, and if you click the subscribe button, you'll see the videos before anyone else. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead, give it a thumbs up, like, please comment, tell us what you think of the video, and let's get into the tips, okay? Tip number 1 for IELTS speaking is speak at length. By the way, all of these tips apply to part 1, part 2, and part 3. We have other videos that break down part 1 in more detail, or part 2, or part 3 specifically. But these 8 tips apply to all 3 parts. And the first is speak at length. For each part of the IELTS speaking test, there is a certain amount of time that you are recommended to use for your answers, okay? So in part 1, you should be ready to give 30-second answers. Part 2, you want to speak for 2 full minutes. And then in part 3, 45 or even 50-second answers. This is really important because if you don't extend your answers long enough, it won't give you time to show off your grammar and vocabulary. And it also won't show that you can put together a well-connected, well-thought-through, extended response. And that's really important for the fluency and coherence criteria in the IELTS speaking scoring. So tip number 1 is speak at length. However, do know that you might not get to give 30-second answers for every answer in part 1, or you might not get to give 45 to 50-second answers for every answer in part 3. The examiner might interrupt you or redirect you, but that's actually a good thing. So don't get frustrated if the examiner interrupts you. That means they're satisfied with whatever you were saying about that, and now they want to hear you talk about something different. Tip number 2 is speak with confidence and enthusiasm. You need to act like you know about the topics that they are asking about. So even if you don't know very much about the topics or questions that they're asking you about, give your response as if you do know about it. That means speak with authority, speak with confidence, speak firmly, speak loudly, okay? If you do this, even if what you're saying is wrong, or it's not very accurate, or you don't know very much about the topic, if you speak with authority and firmness and confidence in your voice and your attitude, it will make your English better, because that's just how our brain works. That's how speech works. If you speak confidently, your English will be better. If you go in with a lot of fear and doubt, or if you just kind of respond to everything like, I don't know, kind of, I don't know, like whatever, the more you doubt your answers, the worse your English will be. I do want to mention, it is okay to tell the examiner that you don't know very much about a certain topic, or you might not even know the answer to a question that they asked. That's fine. You can even tell them that you don't know the answer. But as you tell them you don't know, say it with confidence. Say it with authority. Explain to them why you don't know. So don't be ashamed of not knowing. Don't be ashamed that a topic is unfamiliar for you. Just say what you say with confidence and authority, and also have confidence in your English. Even if your grammar and vocabulary are not the best, just say what you want to say with confidence. Don't keep correcting the grammar. And lots of people, when they get timid, even if it's just because of poor grammar, they will just kind of trail off with their sentences and become less and less clear with their voice because they're ashamed of their grammar. But you don't want to do that. Even if you're speaking in bad grammar, speak it confidently, and that will help your score be better. But it's not enough to just speak with confidence. You also need to speak with enthusiasm. Okay, so speak like you are interested in whatever they are asking you about. Even if you're not interested, pretend like you are. Pretend like this is an interesting, exciting topic and discussion for you. Don't act like you're annoyed with the examiner. Act like they're your friend and act like you're talking to them with enthusiasm and interest. What this will do, it will make all your sentences better. All of your English will be better if you speak with enthusiasm, but especially your intonation will be better. So intonation is, in English, some syllables that we say are higher in pitch and some are lower in pitch. Okay? And this is a very important part of English. If you struggle with intonation, one excellent thing you can do to improve your pronunciation overall is to listen to something that also has a written transcript of exactly what the speaker is saying. And as you listen, pause the recording after every sentence and then repeat that sentence in exactly the same intonation and exactly the same speed, exactly the same sound as the speaker did. And then unpause, do one more sentence, and then pause, unpause, do another sentence, and pause. This is an activity that will greatly increase your pronunciation. We've included an excellent resource for using this activity in the description. If you struggle with pronunciation, we have a special course called ProPronounce as part of our IELTS course, where we as English pronunciation experts teach you exactly how to have perfect pronunciation that will be great for the IELTS exam, but also just for life so that native English speakers can understand you better. So that's an excellent option as well at IELTSCoachPro.com. But now let's get into tip number 3. So tip number 2 was speak with confidence and enthusiasm. Tip number 3 is very similar. Tip number 3 is don't think too much, okay? Some people are natural talkers where you ask them a question, or even if you don't ask them a question, they just start talking and talking. These types of people tend to score a little bit better on the IELTS speaking test just because they like to hear you talking a lot. In the IELTS speaking test, they don't like to see you thinking. So you don't want large hesitations. The reason for this is when you hesitate, sometimes it's difficult for the examiner to know if you are hesitating to think about content or ideas, which that would be fine, but you lose marks when you hesitate to try to think of English. You lose fluency and coherence marks. You also lose vocabulary and grammar marks if it is obvious that you were pausing to think about grammar or vocabulary, because a natural speaker should just have those words and that grammar ready. So if you have to pause to think about it, you lose marks. But sometimes if you pause too much to think of ideas, the examiner will think you're pausing to think of grammar and vocabulary. So you lose a lot of marks if you pause too much, if you think too much. So don't think too much about the grammar. Just say what comes into your mind. And don't think too much about the content or your ideas. Just say the first idea that comes into your head. That will help you get a higher score. And also, don't do lots of self-correction. You can do a little bit. A little bit of self-correction is good. You notice right away that you made error, like you used the wrong word or the wrong verb tense, and you know immediately how to correct it perfectly, then yes, correct yourself. But most of the time, you want to speak without needing to correct yourself. And so most of your sentences, you should start the sentence, finish the sentence, and then start the next one. But a lot of people, they'll start a sentence, they'll go back to the beginning, and they'll start it again. It gets a little confusing for the examiner and for you, and it can really cause your score to go down. So tip number 3, it's very important actually, don't think too much as you're speaking. Think a little, speak a lot in the IELTS speaking exam. Now, on the opposite side of this is very important, and this is tip number 4. Tip number 4 is don't speak too fast. So for students that speak too slow, it's usually because they're thinking too much. But for students who speak too fast, it's normally because you're just used to speaking that fast. Maybe you use a lot of English in your daily life, but you speak with other non-native speakers, but you use a lot of English, and you just develop these patterns of saying certain types of phrases and words really quickly. For whatever reason, if you speak too fast, this will lower your pronunciation score. And I don't want to get into too many of the details right now. If you want more specifics, you can take our course on IELTSCoachPro.com. But there is a range of acceptable speeds in English, and there are certain places where you should pause a little bit more or a little bit less or not at all and just connect words together. The way that you can practice this without taking a course is we've posted that same resource that you can use for repeating sentences. What you can do is you can play the recording and read what he's saying and try to read it at the exact same time that he or she is saying it. Now, you're going to be a little bit off. You cannot speak at exactly the same speed as someone else unless you've practiced with that recording before. But if you just attempt to do this, what it will do is it will gradually regulate your speed overall and your speed of certain words and phrases to be the same as that native speaker that you're listening to on the recording. So you read what he's saying, and as you're listening, you try to say the words exactly as he's saying them, or she. You can also say the words directly after the person, but keep the recording going for this activity. Don't keep pausing it and starting it again, because as the speaker keeps going, you'll keep talking, and hopefully you can match their rate of speed, not just in the overall, but also in the speed that they say each phrase, because that's important in English. The other activity is also helpful for being at the right speed, where you pause, say a sentence, and then listen to a sentence, and then pause. That activity is also helpful for being at the right rate of speech. Both of these activities are extremely good activities. They're working multiple skills as well. Your reading and your listening will also improve. So I highly recommend these. But that's enough about speed. Let's move on to tip number 5. And tip number 5 is do not memorize answers. This is an extremely important one. And if your IELTS Institute or the YouTuber that you are watching tells you to memorize answers, or they say something like, we think on December 24th, the speaking part 2 is going to be this question or this question or this question. So if you memorize these responses, then you'll be good to go. If they say anything like that, run away from that teacher. Like, run away fast. Do not listen to them, because that is a complete misunderstanding of how IELTS works. These questions that they'll ask you in IELTS speaking are completely randomized. And you need to have skills and methods that work for all questions. If you memorize answers and you try to fit memorized answers into the questions that they ask, the examiner will spot it in an instant and start asking you more difficult questions, more questions that are not related to that thing that you memorized. These examiners are experts and they know how to find holes in your English. So if it starts to become evident that you have memorized answers, it will lower your score dramatically. Not just because the examiner starts asking you different questions, but also because even if they just notice a memorized answer, they start lowering your score dramatically. So do not memorize answers. You need to work on your skills and your methods for the IELTS speaking exam. So that's tip number 5. Do not memorize answers. Tip number 6 is don't worry about mistakes. So I talked a little bit before about self-correction. You can do it a little, but not a lot. But the other thing that's important here is don't get frustrated with yourself when you notice a mistake. Even native speakers make small vocabulary errors. They make grammar errors as they speak. They don't get frustrated about it, and they don't let it affect the next 3 or 4 or 5 sentences that they say. So if you're spending brain energy being frustrated about a mistake, it's going to make your next 3, 4, 5, even the entire remainder of the exam, it can make it a lot worse if you're frustrated about a mistake. So if you make a couple mistakes, don't worry, press on. You can still get an excellent score even with a few mistakes. Tip number 7, and this is also important, is don't use fancy words. And what I mean by fancy words are words that are above your English level. So a lot of students will memorize word lists of advanced vocabulary words or band 9 vocabulary, but their English isn't good enough to use those words properly. And then so when you use a word out of place or incorrectly, you lose vocabulary points, but you also will probably lose grammar points. So it's better to use words that are a little bit simpler, but that you are 100% sure you know what they mean and you know how to use them properly. Because with vocabulary, accuracy is much more important than trying to show off some fancy words. Now, if you're at an advanced level and you know some advanced vocabulary and you know how to use it properly, then go ahead, use those advanced words. It will increase your vocabulary score, but only use words that you're 100% sure of the meaning and you're 100% sure of how to use them in a sentence. And then you'll be on your way to getting a great score. Tip number 8 is also very helpful. And tip number 8 is to buy time when needed. So what buying time is sometimes in part 1 or part 3, the examiner will ask you a difficult question that you do need to think about a little bit. And it's natural. Everybody needs to think sometimes when responding to questions. But if you just sit in silence while you're thinking, it might get awkward. You might lose a little bit of marks for extended pause or extended hesitation. You will also lose marks if you just kind of go while you're thinking. So you don't want to use a lot of filler words. You can have a few ums here and there, but you don't want to use a lot of filler words like especially not a lot right stacked on top of each other like So if you get asked a difficult question and you need to buy some time, you can buy time with some nice little phrases like, oh, that's an interesting question, or wow, I've never thought about that before, or let me think about that. So these are some phrases that while you say them, it gives you time to think, but it also shows off a little bit of your English. If you say, let me think about that, you've just given an example of a certain grammar form used correctly. And even these filler phrases, say them with confidence and enthusiasm. Another way that you can buy time is you can ask the examiner to repeat a question. This works in part 1. This works in part 3. This buying time strategy, it doesn't work for part 2, but for part 1 and part 3, you can buy time with a filler phrase, or you can buy time by asking the examiner to repeat the question. In part 3, you can even ask them to explain the question a little bit. Like you can ask them what a certain word in their question means, or you can ask them to rephrase their question. So that's an option that you have in part 3 only. Now, this buying time strategy can be very helpful, but don't overuse it. Don't ask them to repeat like every question, or don't use a filler phrase at the beginning of every answer. Only use it a couple times if needed during your exam, but it can be really helpful, and it's much better for your score to use a filler phrase or to ask them to repeat the question. It's much better than going for 5 seconds while you think of an answer. So that's the last tip. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, please comment, and subscribe. If you need more help with your IELTS preparation in listening or speaking or writing or reading, if you need to improve your grammar, vocabulary, your speed, your core skills, or your writing structures, methods for different question types, all of that. If you need help with anything for IELTS, go to IELTSCoachPro.com. We have a free mock test, but we also have tons of awesome courses where I teach live group classes. I also do one-on-one coaching sessions. We also will grade your writing and give you writing feedback or feedback on your speaking, which is really important actually. So these tips that we gave you for speaking will be very helpful for you, but it's even more helpful to get a speaking coach who can listen to what you say and tell you exactly what your areas for improvement are and tell you exactly how to improve that specific thing that you might be a little bit weaker in. So all the best as you prepare for IELTS. I hope you get the score that you need and can live the life of your dreams. See you next time.